Hello and welcome. My name is Chris Long. I appreciate you taking time today to watch this short presentation focusing on disability insurance for medical students and residents. Just to give you a little bit of background on myself, my partner and I, Greg Hellman, formed a practice about 10 years ago to work exclusively with physicians across the country. My wife also happens to be an anesthesiologist practicing in Columbia, South Carolina. Greg comes from a medical family, and so we both have a lot of experience working with physicians from all ranges of planning, from medical school through retirement. So while we're located in Columbia, South Carolina, we've got clients now in all but just a few states. So it really doesn't matter where you're located. In today's virtual environment, we can meet with you anywhere. So what we want to focus on today is more on the insurance side. You may have already worked with me in the past on loan analysis. We do a lot with student loan management across the country. Today, we're going to talk about disability insurance. And I think the best way to frame disability insurance is to look at this pyramid that talks about the different aspects of financial planning, or at least I like the way I think this puts things in the proper order. At the bottom of this pyramid, we can see we've got income. And I think it's just real easy to visualize that without income, you can't do anything else up above. And the only thing that I know that protects one's income is some form of disability income insurance. That can come from your employer, it can be individual, could even be the government through something like Social Security. So we want to learn a little bit about those different types of products and how they work, because again, without income, we can't do anything else. As I move up this pyramid, the orange section are other insurance products. And the way I like to think of this, in fact, I keep telling myself I should redraw it as a house. And really, it's the yellow section that most people are attracted to. Just like when you go to look at buying a house or even renting a house, but let's talk about buying a house. You know, when you first pull up to it, you're looking at the house, the rooms, what it looks like. You're typically not going to crawl under the crawl space and look at the foundation. But before you buy that house, you would typically hire an inspector, and they're going to crawl around the foundation and the crawl space looking for any structural issues that might impact the integrity of that house up above, right? So in the same way, we can think of insurance products as like if you look at the crawl space of your physical house, you would tend to see all these support block, cinder block support piers holding it up. And if you were to visualize crawling under there with a sledgehammer and knocking some of those out, it wouldn't be hard to visualize the structural impact that that would have on the house above. Well, similarly, as a physician, I imagine you could imagine like what would happen if you were practicing medicine without malpractice insurance and you got sued. Pretty easy to visualize the structural impact that would have on your financial house. Might come down with a crash. So in a similar fashion, these other insurance products are doing the same thing. They're supporting that financial house that we're planning to build. So against the risks of like an early death and unable to work, due to an injury or illness, even like property and casualty insurance, like with a physical house, right? If the house isn't insured, it burns down, there's a significant financial loss there. So just think of these insurance products as the foundation to that house, when really our goal, though, is to build the house. So I think it's totally natural for people when it comes to their financial house to want to focus on the investment side, how to accumulate funds for retirement and other goals, how to minimize the debt, and how do we minimize taxes. So in the long run, we spend the most time there. But as we're getting ready to design and build this house, I think it's critical that we need to focus and think about disability insurance and other insurance aspects to support this house we're going to build. So when it comes to the financial services industry, I always think it's helpful to understand how people are paid And in our industry, I think the bulk of revenue tends to come from insurance commissions and investment management fees or commissions. The things on the left, like I said before, we work with a lot of medical residents and students on how to best manage their student loans. We're often working on budgeting, going over residency and employer benefits, debt management, a lot of the planning side. Well, this side doesn't generate any revenue unless we were going to charge a fee for that service. Well, the way I've approached my business is that we feel like when we're working with medical students and residents, that the probability of you already having a financial advisor is very low. And the probability that you're going to need at some point things like disability or life insurance, or hopefully all of you anticipate that when you finish training, your income's going to go up. You're going to want to do some investing and develop strategies to accumulate wealth for retirement and other goals. And those are the things we can help you with. And so rather than charging you a fee to meet with you and help you with your loans and develop a plan, we're always willing to do that without any fee for the opportunity to be able to help you with your initial insurance planning and then, go on from there. And so a lot of people don't realize that when you purchase a disability insurance contract, for example, from somebody, whoever sells it to you, the insurance company is going to pay them a commission. And generally that commission is roughly 50% of whatever that first year's annual premium was. So if you're spending $100 a month on a disability policy during residency, whoever sells it to you is going to make about $600. And then they're going to get renewal commissions every year you keep that policy, which could be for 30, 35 years. And then when you finish your training and you go to increase your coverage, that's a new policy, that's a new commission. So in the long run, I think we're well compensated by having your insurance business more so than if we were charging you planning fees. Now, a lot of financial advisors, I think, will try to charge a fee for planning, and then they're going to recommend insurance and investment solutions and potentially get compensated again when they implement those by the insurance company or potentially however the investments are being handled. So in my opinion, if you understand what they're getting paid, you should be able to find an advisor that if you're doing insurance business with them, that they should be giving you some help without additional cost on the planning side. Okay, so moving forward, let's focus in on disability insurance, because again, without an income, you can't do anything else. All right. And so I think a common perception that I've seen over the years with medical students and residents is that, when you look at your residency program benefits, disability coverage is almost always being provided to you at no cost. And, I put myself in your position and, honestly, the risk of getting totally disabled is really, really low, right? Therefore, why do you need to consider coverage? And a lot of people might be thinking, well, wouldn't it make more sense to wait until the end of residency so I can see what my attending employer is going to be providing and whether or not I even need to mess with individual coverage. So it seems expensive. The risk is low. It's very easy to put it off until the end of training. And there are some issues with that I want to start to bring to your attention. So before we get there, I think you need to understand a little bit about the difference between employer provided coverage and individual coverage. So with employer provided coverage, there's typically two broad definitions of disability that we need to be concerned with. The first is an any occupation definition of total disability. Basically what that means, let's say you're a surgeon and something happens and you crush your hand and you can't do surgery anymore. Well, you're going to file a claim with the insurance company. The insurance company is going to come in, they're going to assess the situation, and they're probably going to agree that, hey, we realize you can't do surgery anymore. And we're sorry about that. However, we think based on your education, training, and background, that you could still do a lot of other things so we don't have to pay. So in essence, what that means is if the insurance company thinks you're still able to do any other occupation, then you're not totally disabled and you won't get that disability benefit. Most programs and employers are going to have some form of own occupation definition, meaning now if you're that surgeon, you crush your hand and you can't do surgery anymore, then they may consider you as totally disabled from being a surgeon. And then some of those contracts would allow you to work in a completely different occupation and still receive that disability benefit, even if you're earning income in that other occupation. Others might allow you to work in a different occupation, but as you start earning income in that different occupation, they may start to reduce that benefit. Of what's usually the biggest concern with employer contracts is we see a lot of residency programs across the country where the definition is an own occupation, but only for like the first 2 years. And then it turns into an any occupation definition after that. So unfortunately, a lot of times people don't discover these contractual terms and definitions until something bad happens, and then it's simply too late. You can't go back and supplement or do anything about it. Okay, so as we move up this curve, essentially a pricing curve, then we start to get into the individual specialty specific contracts. And those contracts, again, you could be disabled from working in your specialty. And if you're able to do anything else, you can do whatever you want, earn income, and they're not going to reduce your disability benefit as long as you're disabled from working in your specific specialty or subspecialty. Well, right now in the market, we typically see these six companies that are the leading carriers for individual specialty specific own occupation disability contracts. So this is where most of the medical market's going to be. Now, in this presentation, I'm not going to get into a lot of the general terms and terminology. Just rest assured that it's these contracts with these companies that you're going to be steered towards from anybody working in the medical market. Okay. Now, in my opinion, they're all really good companies and they all have excellent contracts. There are some differences between them, but honestly, in my opinion, the differences between them are really small in comparison to the difference between any of these individual contracts and even the best employer provided contracts. And when we meet individually, I'm happy to dig into that deeper and help you really understand why. All right, so moving on, let's look at what happens when you're in residency. So typically, again, most programs are providing group long-term disability at no cost. So let's say you're making $60,000 a year. So if I run a simple paycheck calculator and account for tax withholdings, then typically if you're making $60,000 a year, your net salary after deductions for taxes is going to be around $36.93 a month. Okay. So let's say we look in your benefits book and it says that you have group long-term disability provided at no cost that covers 60% of your base pay. Well, 60% of $60,000 is $36,000 a year. So that's $3,000 a month of gross income if you're totally disabled. Well, one thing you may or may not know is that if your program or your employer provides disability coverage to you at no cost as an employee benefit, then should you become disabled, that income is going to be taxable income. So if I now run a paycheck calculator on $36,000 a year, and we look at what the anticipated withholdings would be for federal and state taxes, you're down to $23.30. So essentially, with that scenario, you're taking about a $1,300 to $1,400 pay cut if you were to be unable to work due to illness or injury. Now, I can pretty much guarantee that's probably going to be an issue based on the residency salary and the number of folks I've worked with and looking at what their budgets and surplus cash is. Not very many are going to have $1,300 of surplus that they don't need. So what we could do is we could supplement that with an individual disability policy. Now, all those insurance companies right now will let a medical resident get as much as $5,000 of monthly tax-free benefit for total disability. Okay. Now, that's additive to whatever your employer provides. So if you supplement your group insurance with individual coverage and you say get clobbered in an accident, you're totally disabled, and your residency program's coverage pays a benefit, then you would also get your individual benefit. So in that case, in the example I'm using here, if your group policy pays $3,000 gross, $2,330 net after taxes, and you've got an individual policy that pays $5,000 a month, then you'd be taking home about $7,330 a month tax-free for total disability. Well, that's about twice what you're bringing home as a resident. And so essentially the insurance companies, all of them will promote and let you get overinsured during residency because they know that you still have a financial incentive to get well, go on and finish training and practice because you're obviously going to make a lot more as an attending. So it's one of the rare situations where you can actually get overinsured for a little bit. Now, what's the probability though, right, of getting disabled during residency? It's very low. And I totally agree with that. But I'm here to tell you that from where I sit, that's not the big risk. Okay, I would argue that the big risk is getting stuck with some type of what I call a medical exclusion, or even getting declined for individual coverage if you put this off until the end of residency. And I want to explain that. So when you go to apply for an individual policy, you've got to go through two underwriting processes. The first is financial underwriting. Well, that's pretty easy. They're just looking at your income. They want to see maybe some pay stubs, tax returns. They want to look at your employer coverage. They want to know what you have, and they're going to calculate if you're eligible for additional coverage. Now, usually in residency, the insurance companies waive the financial underwriting requirement, and they allow you to ignore your employer coverage and let you get up to that $5,000 limit for individual coverage if you want it. But medical underwriting is almost always going to take place. And medical underwriting entails a lot more than most people ever imagine. You've got to go through and disclose a complete medical history questionnaire, answering all kinds of questions about your health, background, etc. They're typically going to want to get access to your medical records, either through MyChart now, or they may request them individually from each of your providers. They're going to run a pharmacy scan, and they're going to get a list of all the medications that you've been prescribed and who prescribed them. And if there's doctors that turn up on that pharmacy scan that you didn't disclose and the physicians that you see, they're going to want to potentially go after records and track those down and find out what was going on when that medication was prescribed. They're typically going to request a blood and urine sample, run a full metabolic profile, and look for anything out of whack. And basically what's going on is the insurance company, whichever one it is looking for anything in your medical history that they think might put you at a higher risk of filing a claim at any point in your future career. And if they find something, then they could potentially exclude it from being covered, or they could decline you, or they could say, hey, we'll give you coverage, but it's going to cost more, or it's going to have a shorter benefit period than somebody without that condition might otherwise be eligible for. And I think that's the key thing here to latch onto, is there's so many things that can come up in your medical history that you wouldn't think are an issue, not even remotely related to being disabled, but the insurance company is going to look at it very differently. So what I've got here is just, I'm going to go through very quickly some snippets of letters that medical students and residents receive when they apply for disability insurance. This first one was they were approved, but it had an exclusion for heartburn. And so even though it had been treated with nissen fundoplication, if this resident or this physician ever has anything related to heartburn, an ulcer, something like that, that might cause them not to be able to work, it's not going to be covered. This middle one was actually an anesthesia resident that I was working with down, I think, in Louisiana. And the story she told me is she took her kids to an ice skating rink for a birthday party. And she said her little one was having trouble on the ice. So she walks out like any good mom would do to help her son off the ice. And some teenager loses control, wipes out into her. She fell, distal radial fracture of her right wrist. Now, about a year and a half later, that's healed. She's recovered. She goes to apply for individual disability at the end of residency. And the best offer she could get with any company had a permanent exclusion on her wrist. So what that means now is if she ever in the future can't intubate a patient, do a regional blocker procedure, or even mask a patient because of a complication with that wrist, it's not going to be covered. Back injuries. We see a lot of back injuries. One of the craziest ones I've seen several of these now over the years, but I had a resident was doing a super risky activity. She was sitting on the couch one night watching TV. She sneezed and herniated a disc. I'm like, my gosh, did the windows break? I mean, there's a little bit of humor in there, but in all seriousness, she went and got an MRI. MRI shows a bulge. I think she told me she got a steroid injection. And then everything was fine. And literally by the time we were meeting, she didn't think anything was wrong with her. The insurance company gets those records and they actually declined her. And they said, look, we'll look at her again in 3 years. And if her medical records support that she's had no problems with her back, then the best case scenario is she'll get coverage, but it's going to have a permanent exclusion on her lower back. And that's exactly what happened. They're concerned about that disc when she gets older, impeding her ability to work at full capacity and filing a claim. So a lot of back issues. Females, just for your information, females, by the way, have higher morbidity statistics than males. So females pay more for disability than males do. So that's one thing to always keep in mind when you're comparing rates. You can never ask if you're female, you can't ask a male resident what their rate is. It's going to be different than yours and vice versa. So you need to compare male to male, female to female within the same specialty, because even different specialties are going to have different rates. And we'll look at some of that a little bit later. But we see a lot of things, infertility. In fact, one time I had a client, her and her husband were trying to get pregnant. They've been unsuccessful. And in her OB records, there was simply reference to the possibility of seeking infertility treatment. They hadn't decided to do anything like that yet, but because it was in the records, the insurance company put a permanent exclusion for pregnancy. Because they're concerned about the risk of multiple births and related complications that can come from that. All right, so moving on, mental nervous. I mean, honestly, I don't know how you get through medical school and residency without some anxiety, depression, and probably a few other DSM categories there. I just don't. But the reality is that the insurance company is going to have a problem with that. And best case scenario, if you're taking something for anxiety, depression, or even ADHD, you're going to have a mental, nervous, and substance abuse disorder exclusion on your contract. And a lot of people are taking these things for very good reasons, but it never would have crossed their mind that an insurance company is now going to look at them differently and put an exclusion or something like that on their policy. Here's just a few more, psoriasis or psoriatic arthritis. So here they've had an exclusion. It's going to cost 50% more. They're limiting the benefit period to 10 years, and they're not letting us put some riders that we would like to have on this contract. Here's another one for ADHD. They're putting a mental nervous exclusion on it. They're saying we can look at them again in 5 years, and providing there's been no further symptoms or treatment, then they may look at removing that exclusion. Here's one where they put an exclusion on the feet because of bunions, and permanent due to this particular specialty this client was in. So, I mean, would you have thought bunions were going to result in a permanent exclusion on your feet? So now if anything happens, any type of disease, disorder, or impairment of the feet, it's not covered. Right shoulder. So, we see a lot of orthopedic type stuff. So an exclusion on the shoulder. Here we have some issues with esophagus through the EOE. And so they put an exclusion there. Here's one, this surprised me, but a ganglion cyst. And apparently they have a tendency to come back. So they put a permanent exclusion on this person's right wrist due to this ganglion cyst. And that's not something that you can make go away or undo. I don't think anybody would have considered this to be a disabling situation. Again, another mental nervous, someone taking propranolol just to help with anxiety, giving presentations in front of their class. No other issues. They only take it PRN when they're getting ready to give a big presentation. But they've got a mental nervous exclusion. Hobbies. So some hobbies, mountain climbing, rock climbing, if you engage in those activities and that's a known thing you do, then they're likely to exclude that. So if you fall and break something while rock climbing, it may not be covered. Here's another one, wrist, thumb exclusion due to some tendonitis. So again, these are very common things we see a lot of, and none of these, I don't think anybody would agree to be disabling, right? Even insomnia, so someone taking melatonin over a long term, they're putting an exclusion. Again, mental nervous stuff. So we see lots and lots of medical exclusions, and honestly, for things that often turn up for the first time during residency. Okay, so what I want to introduce now is that from a prophylactic standpoint, the reason that we promote getting disability insurance in place as early as you can in residency, it's because you're more likely to get through the medical underwriting process without any issues. And if we can get through the medical underwriting process, and let's say they're not putting any exclusions on your contract, then we can prophylactically protect future access to coverage as an attending and beyond without ever having to answer a medical question again. And in my opinion, that's the most significant thing that you should be doing during residency. I just don't see the risk of getting totally disabled as being very high, but the risk of having some type of non-disabling injury or illness or something like all these examples we just went through is certainly significantly greater than zero. And so all the insurance companies have some type of rider that if you go through underwriting, we can put it on the contract, and it guarantees now that you can increase your coverage in the future with no medical questions. Now, there's two types of these riders on the market right now. One is typically called a future increase option rider. It's been the most common historically. Now, that rider has a cost to it. It gives you a pool of coverage that you can access typically up until the age of 55, where you can go through medical underwriting, or they won't be any medical underwriting required. I'm sorry, you still have to go through financial underwriting. And if financially you're eligible for more coverage, then they give you an annual option where you can apply to increase your coverage with no medical questions. So if there's no exclusions on your original contract, then you can increase your coverage up to that limit without ever answering a medical question again. And even if there's now something known to be wrong with you, like you've broken your hand or wrist or had a back issue, it doesn't matter. Contractually, the insurance company, whichever one it is bound to be able to increase your coverage now without any medical questions, and therefore no new exclusions. Now, one that we're starting to see more and more people use is this benefit purchase option rider. And I think the main reason is it doesn't cost anything. Now, instead of giving you an annual option to increase coverage, here they give you an option every 3 years. Now, it's a little more cumbersome because every 3 years, you literally have to complete an application applying for additional coverage. Now, they're going to go through the financial underwriting and determine if you're eligible for any more. If you are, then they expect you to take at least 50% of the amount of coverage you're eligible for, or they're going to take that rider off the contract. And then the only way to increase it going forward would be with full medical underwriting. So what happens with most people is you get out, you increase your coverage, and then you're typically maxed out. And so every 3 years, you may have to complete an application, but if your income isn't increasing substantially, then you're probably not eligible for any more, but you still may want to keep doing that, because what can happen is if you ever leave your employer, say you're employed by a hospital, and you decide to go into private practice or take a job somewhere else where they don't provide employer coverage, then that would give you a mechanism now to be able to increase your coverage without any medical questions. Because honestly, the probability that something's going to creep up in your medical history only increases with age, right? Okay. So again, I want to shift the mindset away from the risk of getting totally disabled, because I think it's really low. It should be more the risk of having something happen that doesn't make you disabled, but now impacts your ability to get clean coverage in place to protect that attending income. That risk is substantially higher. So the increase option riders, the future increase option rider, which again, I see the most people trying to sell that rider. It's going to cause you to have to get more coverage than you may want to pay for during residency. Because if we look at the scenario we went through, I could argue that all you need is a benefit amount of $1,363. And that if you got that, because remember you had the 60,000 of income, your net income was 3,600. And then if you only had your group coverage, you're going to be about $1,300 short of what you were taking home. So if you supplemented that residency policy that's being provided at no cost with an individual contract for $1,363 of benefit, then, and you did get disabled, then you'd be 100% insured, right? Well, the problem is if you just got $1,363 of coverage, then the maximum amount of future increase option rider that you would have access to is 2 to 3 times that. So 3 times $1,363 is $4,089. So if you only got $1,363 of benefit, you would only prophylactically protect access to another $4,089 of coverage, which probably is not enough based on almost every specialty's income. So what happens there is you almost have to get, the maximum amount of coverage they'll issue if you want to have access, in this case, say to another 15,000 of coverage, so that you could get 5,000 in residency and now have a pool where you could increase your coverage another 15,000 a month for a total of 20 without ever answering any medical questions. So the downside of doing it that way is that it's going to cost more because you've got to get more coverage early. The upside is that if you did get totally disabled during residency, you've got 5,000 of benefit instead of a lower amount. Okay. And every company that offers this type of rider, it's a cost associated with it. What I'm seeing more people do now, especially when they understand what their options are, is they're going with the benefit purchase option type rider. And again, what it does is it lets you get less coverage during residency. So it costs you less, but you've still gone through the medical underwriting. So now prophylactically, you have that mechanism where you know you can increase your coverage up to whatever that company's issue limits are, which can be anywhere from 20 to 30,000 a month without ever having to answer a medical question again. That is really significant because the problem, like with most things in healthcare, is injuries, accidents, these things, they always come upon us unexpectedly. And then it's too late. So that's one of the crazy things about insurance is you can only get it when you don't need it. The second you think you might need it, you can't get it anymore. So you've got to take action on these things when you don't need it. Therefore, otherwise something may change and then it's too late. So again, what we're trying to protect is your future income potential. And so here I've got somebody, say, making 200,000 of income. They're going to make over $12 million in their career, potentially double that depending on inflation increases and increasing income, et cetera, but at least $12 million if their income is pretty flat. Now, on the left side, I've got somebody that feels like, well, I don't think the risk is low, so I'm going to invest this $1,200. If I'm going to otherwise be spending $100 a month on disability insurance, I'm going to invest it. Well, if I invested that for 4 years and got an 8% return, it would grow during residency to $5,840. If I let that continue to hypothetically grow at 8%, 35 years later, I've got a whopping $63,000. That's not going to hardly do anything if you now can't work because of an unexpected injury or illness, or you've had something happen like a surgeon, you've now hurt your hand, and the only disability insurance you get has an exclusion on your hand, so it's not covered. You don't want to be in that situation because, again, you typically can't undo it, and so you're stuck and vulnerable for the rest of your career. So from a fiduciary, doing in your best interest planning perspective, my first thing I want to see my clients do from an insurance standpoint is at least get the minimum amount of disability insurance where you go through medical underwriting so you can secure that rider that allows you to increase it in the future when you finish your training without ever having to answer a medical question again. Because if something unexpectedly happens, you are stuck and you have very limited options as far as what you can then try to do to protect that income. So I just want people to understand and see that you're putting a tremendous amount at risk for the opportunity to gain very little from, say, an investment perspective. Okay. All right. So here's just some numbers. I've taken off the specific companies just to avoid any, conflict there. But basically, if we look at these companies, then some of them, like these two options on the left, that means those options, they only have the future increase option rider type, right? So they kind of force you to get like 5,000 of coverage if you want to have access to another 15,000 to get to 20,000 without any medical questions. Well, that's going to cost you more. So now you're spending $170 to $200 or more a month to carry that 5,000 of benefit. Now, other companies have both options, the future increase option rider, or they also have the benefit purchase type option rider. And you can choose one or the other. Some only have the benefit increase rider, some only have the future increase option rider. Some have both. Now, company C here, for instance, they say in order to get that benefit increase rider that you want, you have to get at least 50% of the amount of coverage that you're eligible for when you apply before they'll put that rider on the contract. So in that case, we couldn't apply for $1,000 of coverage with this company because they give us $1,000 of coverage, but they wouldn't put the rider we want on it. So here we have to get at least 2,500, but once we secure that, we can literally get all the way up now to, I think, $30,000 a monthly benefit without ever having to answer a medical question again. Other companies, their threshold is 75% of what you're eligible for. So as a resident, you're automatically eligible for 5,000. So you'd have to get $3,750 of monthly benefit before those companies would put that rider on the contract that lets you increase in the future. One company, they don't care, as long as you get $1,000 of coverage, they'll put that rider on the contract. Some have limits for students. So if you were a medical student when you apply before graduation, then we could get 75% of the 2,500, which is 1,875, and put that in place and still prophylactically protect access to higher coverage in the future with no medical questions. Now, you'll see on here that there's a slash. And so some of these companies have two different premium options. Basically, what that means is those companies either offer a level premium or a graded premium. So graded premium just means it starts low and it's going to increase a little bit every year. Level premium starts higher but never changes. The coverage is the same. So what most of our resident clients do to minimize cost is they go with the graded premium. And then at the end of residency, the companies that offer a graded premium will let you convert it from graded to level with no medical or financial questions. You just start paying a little bit higher premium on the back end than you would have if you'd started out level. But usually the cost savings of doing graded during residency, for most folks, they feel like, well, that's worth more to me during residency when my budget's tight than spending an extra $100 a year to switch it to level as an attending when I'm now making $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 or more. But we can go either way, and we can discuss those individually. And so different specialties are going to have different costs associated. And again, male versus female. So you can see here, female rates are a good bit higher than male rates. Okay. And you know, the insurance companies tell us that females have higher morbidity statistics, so you have higher claims rates, and so you pay more. If we go to look at different specialties, then you know, somebody in pediatrics is going to pay a lower premium than a surgeon or an internist, even for that matter. And females are going to pay more than males. Now, there are still a few programs scattered across the country where we can find sex neutral rates, but that's something we'd help you with. So typically what we're doing when we're meeting with our medical students in transition to residency is we're going to look up together, if we don't already have information on file, figure out what your residency program is providing, what they have access to, look at what the individual options are, see if there's any discounts available, and then help you determine what's the best product for your specialty and your specific situation. Some companies are much more sensitive to things like a mental nervous history than others. So we've got to understand your medical history a little bit and help you, point you in a direction as to which company is going to be the best. We're appointed with all these companies, all 6 of them. So we're happy to put you in any one of them. Our job, though, is to act as a fiduciary, where we're going to always do what's in your best interest. So I'm a certified financial planner, which means I'm held to a fiduciary standard of always doing what's in my client's best interest. Now, I fully disclose that our potential sources of compensation are going to come from insurance commissions, investment commissions, or advisory fees. And again, we do have the ability to charge a planning fee or consulting fee, but I almost always waive that for medical students and residents because the probability is so high that you're going to need insurance. And if you're going to need it and we can get you the same product at the same price anybody else can, I hope you do it with us over just doing it with whoever, comes and talks to the program down the road. We'll list potential conflicts of interest, usually could arise between insurance companies. And again, we do a lot across the country with student loan consulting. And so there's some disclosure information there. So we'll send you this document. It's about 5 pages long. It's not any kind of contract or agreement. It's simply a disclosure document that every certified financial planner is required to provide to people we're working with. Okay. And so again, I'll go back to this prophylactic foundation, and that honestly, we just never had a resident that we couldn't develop a plan when they finish training, as long as they have income. But every year we see too many residents discover they're uninsurable, can't protect their income, or have to pay more, or end up with some type of exclusion or get declined. And so often it's something that's come up during residency and they had no idea it was even an issue. So we really encourage you to take action on this as early as possible. The tendency is to want to put it off until residency starts, figure out what's going on there. But honestly, when residency starts, it's like being thrown in an alligator pit. And it's just all about survival. When you come up for a breath of air trying to survive, the last thing you're really going to want to do is talk about insurance and dig into this stuff. It's just not fun. So it's really during your last year of medical school, like around match day and beyond, and to when residency starts, it's the ideal time for us to work together, start developing a transition plan. We'll look at your student loans if we haven't done that already. We'll make specific recommendations for disability insurance. I've got another presentation on life insurance I would encourage you to watch. If that's appropriate, we'll make recommendations there. And then we'll typically recommend you get into underwriting, which means you're applying. And that doesn't cost anything. So it doesn't cost anything to apply and underwrite and have the insurance company come back with an offer. Then we can sit on that offer and discuss it and decide when or if you want to put it into place. And the other thing I like to tell people is that, you're not bound to it. So all you ever have to do to get out of an insurance contract is simply quit paying for it. Nothing bad happens. Insurance companies don't report to credit agencies. You're just not going to have your coverage anymore. So I don't want anybody to feel like we're putting you in a corner that you can't get out of. What we want to do is get you covered so if something does unexpectedly change, we can still protect your income. If nothing changes, then we typically want to review the marketplace at the end of residency anyway. Again, make sure there's not something better on the market, because if nothing's changed with your health, then everything is still on the table, because we could always apply with a different company. And if there's a better product at that time and you get approved, we could then drop the policy you started out with. So we want this to be flexible. We want it to be very non-threatening. We want to do what's in your best interest. And we want to get you protected as early as we can for the lowest cost we can, so that if something does unexpectedly change, you're protected. And we don't lose this investment, this substantial investment you've made in your medical career. So I hope that this has been informative and that it helps. Here's our contact information. We recommend that you reach out to my office manager, Nancy Glass here, call her, email her. If you want to email or call me, you're welcome to do so, or my partner, Greg. And we'll schedule a time to meet with you, go through some specific recommendations, answer any questions you have. And then when you are totally comfortable with what the best course of action is for yourself, we'll help you implement it. That's it. So thank you so much for attending today and spending the time watching this. Hope it made sense, and we look forward to working with you.